We're going to go ahead and get started with our third presenter for this afternoon. Dr. John Patience is currently Professor Emeritus of Animal Science at Iowa State University. He earned his PhD from Cornell University in 1985. After 21 years at Prairie Swine Center in Saskatoon, John joined the faculty of the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State University in Applied Research and Extension. One of his passions was the training of graduate students for careers in the industry and academia. John remains active in consulting to pork producers and the feed industry locally and internationally. His consultancy focuses on nutrition and management, as well as in the planning and implementation of strategic research programs. John has more than 30 years of experience studying all aspects of water and solving problems at the farm level. He is therefore looking forward to his participation in the 2021 Iowa Swine Day on one of his favorite topics. Please help me in welcoming Dr. John Patience.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I guess you can all hear me at the back, probably without the microphone, but that's okay. They need that for the taping. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I always love coming to Iowa Swine Day, and in particular talking about one of my favorite topics, which is water. Water's been a funny topic for me for research and extension over my career because it kind of, pardon the pun, but it ebbs and flows in interest, right? Sometimes there's great interest in it, and other times you can't draw flies. And right now there seems to be a lot of interest in water, and this is my 7th talk since November to talk about water. So we're on a high right now. So it's a good time to retire, right? You know, a good time to leave when you're on the upside. So what I tried to do today in putting together my presentation is to pick topics that have come up most frequently at previous meetings, through phone call inquiries, email inquiries, and so on. So hopefully hit the topics that are going to be of most interest to you. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about giving an overview and why is water overlooked. I'm going to talk a little bit about when in a pig's life is it or can it be that by providing water ad libitum, the pig may not be drinking enough water. I think we all assume, or mostly assume, that as long as we have good quality fresh water coming through the drinker, the pig is going to self-regulate. They might overdrink, but they won't underdrink. I'm going to show you some data that I think challenges that assumption. I'm going to talk about, do you have a potential water quality issue? And if so, what can you do about it? And I'm going to talk about, do you have a potential water sanitation issue, and what can you do about it? One of the things that's changed in the last couple of years has been a great increase in the delivery of medications through the drinking water rather than through the feed. And there's lots of good reasons for doing that, lots of good reasons. But there's some challenges as well, and I want to help to identify some of those challenges. And then I want to talk a little bit about water supply issues, which is something we probably don't ever think about, and we should be, and I'll explain why. So that's the outline. We're a small group. If you have any questions as I'm going through my talk, please feel free to ask me any questions that you might have, including you, Chloe. You're welcome to ask me a question anytime, okay, just to center you out a little bit there. And Chloe worked for me in my lab before she joined Laura Greiner's program as a graduate student. So, just to think about the importance of water. When you think of your barn, is there any place in the barn you can go where you don't see either water being supplied or water pipes or water treatment or whatever? It's pretty darn hard, right? That water is pretty much everywhere in the barn, and that gives us a little bit of insight into how important water is and the central role that it plays. Then, it's a little more difficult, but can you think of a single life function that does not involve water? Now, some of these are not quite as obvious as others. So, for example, water's involved in maintaining constant body temperature. I think we're all aware that maintaining constant body temperature is absolutely essential for life. If we get too high a temperature, then proteins start to break down and they don't function and bad things happen to us. Water is critically important and chemically designed perfectly to fulfill that role. It's absolutely amazing. It's involved in acid-base balance. And just like changes in temperature can disrupt proteins, changes in pH can disrupt proteins and the functioning of proteins. And if that happens, then we're in trouble. And water is, again, because of its chemistry, ideally suited to fulfill its role in contributing to acid-base balance. And it's involved in various chemical reactions. You know, we talk about building protein in the body of the pig as it's growing. Well, the chemical reactions involved in that involve water. And the breakdown of some of the constituents of feed so that we can convert the feed into a form of energy that can be used by the pig metabolically also involves water. So when you start to think about it, and then there's other purposes, just think for a minute, what would you look like and how would you function if your inside your skin covering was not semi-liquid? In other words, really, we created a skin in evolution so we could leave the swamp and move on to dry land, but we had evolved, and everything about us evolves to function within a liquid environment, so we walk around carrying our own liquid environment with us. So think for a minute if you didn't have a liquid environment to do what you're trying to do. And you think about that too much and you think, man, that'd be a tough way to live. Okay? So water is really, really important. So if it's so darned important, why do we take it for granted? And actually, it took a while, but I finally figured it out after about 30 years. And that is that we take it for granted because it's abundant. It's largely, for most people, either free or very low cost. And it's also convenient to supply to the pig. It's really not that difficult. We put in the water pipes, we put in dish drinkers, nipple drinkers, wet dry feeders, whatever we're going to do to supply the water. It's relatively simple. And if you're a pork producer and you're going into the barn in the morning and you're looking at the things that you need to do, if there's something you don't have to pay attention to because it kind of looks after itself, you got enough other things that you have to deal with that you're going to take it for granted, right? There's one other thing besides water that we really take for granted. Can you think of what that is? We're a small enough group, we can have a little bit of fun here. And can you think of something else that we just take for granted? And it's air. Absolutely. It's free, it's abundant, and it's convenient. Now, we don't live very long if we don't have access to air. It's pretty dang important. But we take it for granted too. And we can't live more than a fair number of hours if it's hot and maybe days if it's not too hot without water. We can live without feed a lot longer. But these very essential things, I guess that's kind of how we ended up being on this planet the way we are because they're abundant, free, and convenient. Take a look at that picture, and it's a pretty typical picture in the barn, because the one thing that I notice looking at the barn is this. Those pigs are wasting a lot of water. And a typical nipple drinker of this type, i.e. one that's fixed to the wall, will waste at least 30% of its flow. So in other words, of the water that flows through that nipple drinker, at the most, 70% ends up inside the pig. Now, if in your barn you were wasting 30% of your feed, you'd probably get on top of that pretty quick. But feed's not free, right? Okay? If you were wasting 30% of your time on something that you really didn't have to waste it on, you'd do something about it pretty quickly. But we just take for granted that it's okay for pigs to waste 30% of their water because it's abundant, it's free, and it's convenient. I'm going to come back to my very last point where I think we need to... Jason Ross this morning talked about dogma and changing how we look at things, and I think we're going to have to change how we look at that. So moving on to the next point is, when in a pig's life might it not be drinking enough water? And so let's take a look. And before I even start, I'm going to apologize for some slides that they're not as old as I am, but they are quite old. And I apologize for that. But the problem is there's no more recent data, right? And Dave Fraser, and I'm going to quote a number of his studies, just did phenomenal work. And this kind of work is extremely expensive and extremely difficult to do, very technically demanding. And so nobody's repeated it, but I show it with reasonable confidence because in those parts of water studies where we have repeated older work more recently, it's repeated very, very well. So there's no reason for us to believe that this work, which was done in the 1980s, would not apply now. And what this slide is showing is that the more active the sow is, early after farrowing, in this case 3 days after farrowing, the more water that she drinks. Or the corollary to that is the less active that sow is, the less water she drinks. Now that sow, we expect her to produce a lot of milk, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. She can't produce milk if she's not drinking water. And there's consequences of this shown in this slide. This is also from Dave Fraser's work, and this was probably one of the most difficult studies that he did. And the bottom slide shows the relationship between sow water intake and piglet weight gains. So each one of these dots represents a litter, and you can see there's a pretty good correlation there that when sow water intake is low, litter gain in the first 3 days after farrowing is also very low. Now, if you're thinking critically, you can say, well, John, she might not be drinking much water because she's not producing much milk, and she's not producing much milk because her litter's growing slow, right? So cause and effect can't be determined here, but I don't think that makes sense. So clearly, we want those sows drinking as much water as possible in those first few days after farrowing. Now, when we get into the second day of life, the relationship isn't quite as strong, but once again, if we were to sort of draw a line here, those pigs, those litters that are growing slowest are nursing sows that are drinking the least amount of water. So I think then we can kind of conclude that there's a possibility at least that the newly farrowed sow may not be drinking as much water as she needs to be drinking, and we need to find ways to help her do that better. Now, here's an interesting study. I think this is my last Dave Fraser study, and this compares water use by 10 litters, FASS that were slow-growing litters and FASS that were faster-growing litters, and notice that the water use is lower in the fast-growing piglets, right? And this is up to 4 days after birth, and certainly look at the first 2 to 3 days. And it's the slow-growing pigs that are drinking the greatest amount of water. And you kind of look at that and say, well, if they're drinking a lot of water, how come they're not growing faster? But then if you look at it the other way around, kind of physiologically, if they're not growing fast, they're not drinking much milk. And a lot of the water, moisture that they ingest is from the milk. And those piglets can become dehydrated pretty easily, and especially if they're under a heat lamp or on a heating pad. And so there's a great risk that those pigs could become dehydrated. And so they're going to be motivated to drink a lot of water. And so that might explain, but that's only an interpretation. And you may have a different interpretation of the data, why the slower growing pigs in those first few days are drinking more water than the faster growing pigs. But again, it points us in the direction of where should we be looking in order to manage water supply most effectively, or maybe more effectively than we do now. The next one is an area that I found fascinating because it just befuddles me. It just completely befuddles me. Why do pigs drink after weaning? So this is days after weaning, and these are 3 different qualities of water, these 3 different lines, and this is the quantity of water that the pigs are drinking. And they start out drinking a relatively higher amount of water, and then by day 3 or 4, their water intake is at its lowest. What can possibly explain that? Why would they be drinking less water on days 3 and 4 than they would be on days 1 and 2? But after that 3, 4, or 5 day period, then water intake kind of increases along with feed intake. There's that close relationship between water intake and feed intake, which makes complete sense. So that's okay, but that's those first 3, 4 days. The other thing that I'm just going to point out very quickly is the solid dots. This line, which is the lowest water intake, is the best quality water. It's the lowest TDS, right? So the squares here, that is over 4,000 parts per million of total dissolved solids. That's not considered the best kind of water you can supply to a pig, and yet the pigs are drinking more of that than they are the water with only 200 parts per million. So keep that in mind. We're going to talk about water quality later. So here's another study which really didn't help me to answer the question because, again, same pattern of water intake, and half the pigs were getting treatment where they didn't have very much diarrhea, and half were getting quite serious diarrhea. And it didn't matter. They still drank less water as diarrhea got worse. Now, how can that be? I think we all agree pigs are not stupid. They do things to annoy us, but they're not stupid. And so why would a pig have pretty severe diarrhea and be drinking less water? I don't have an answer for that one. I really don't. I just don't understand that one. Okay, and as I said, please feel free to ask me any questions or comment or disagree with me. I'm retired now. You can disagree with me all you want. Okay, so you too, Chloe. Sorry. Anyhow, I want to talk a little bit about how we supply water to the pig, and in particular, I want to talk about flow rate in the nipple drinker. And this is 4 flow rates. This is work done by Peter Brooks from England. And so if we look at water disappearance, no surprise, as the flow rate increases, water disappearance increases. And by disappearance, I'm referring to water flowing through the water line. Doesn't matter whether it goes into the pig or onto the floor, it's disappeared. Okay? And so it increases in a linear fashion, no surprise there. If we look at average daily gain, however, that pretty much peaks out at 1.9 cups per minute, and we can increase the water flow rate up to 3 cups a minute, and we don't get spit in terms of improved growth rate. Not a bit. Look at feed conversion, and feed conversion is best in the 1.5 to 1.9. So if we look at the required water that these pigs have, and that works out here, and that will be related to growth rate, by the way, then we can see how much water is being wasted. So the message to take home here is increasing nipple flow rates is not necessarily going to get you better water intake. Once the pig's drinking enough water, increasing the flow rate isn't going to help them drink more water. And it isn't going to help the pig grow any faster. And if you happen to be remembering nipple drinker flow rates in the metric system, this is 450 mils per minute. I virtually guarantee that it wouldn't take you very long on the internet to find a recommendation for nipple drinker flow rates for nursery pigs of 750 to 1,000 mils per minute. And as you can see, definitely don't need that. Definitely don't need that at all. Mike Brum did some really... Sorry, yes? And it could, yes. Yeah. Pressure's important, absolutely, Wayne. And oh, damn, I had another thought. Yes, what changes, and I don't think I have it on this slide, but I do have the data, that as the flow rate increased, the amount of times the pig spent drinking goes down. Okay? So that kind of fits in with your point, Wayne. But good point. The pressure in the system would play a role, and the number of nipples that are available. But this was just looking at the total water that was available to these pigs. Okay. Okay, so Mike Brum's work on how we might supply, or different ways that we supply water to pigs in grow finished, comparing wet-dry feeders with dry feeders. So the dry feeders just had a standard nipple drinker affixed to the pen wall, and you can see the wet-dry feeder reduce the wastage of water quite a bit. Swinging nipples, so the nipples that hang from the ceiling, compared to wall-mounted nipple drinkers, the swinging nipples reduce waste substantially as well. And comparing a bowl versus the swinging nipple drinker reduces it even more. So really, if you take a look at the data in total, in terms of conserving water, the wet-dry feeder and the bowl drinker would be the preferred methods. Now, a lot of us don't like bowl drinkers very much because they get easily fouled, especially if they're in the wrong location in the pen. So they're not particularly popular, although I certainly see barns with them. But obviously the wet-dry feeders are fairly popular. Okay, let's just break down the water that a sow is receiving and where that water goes to. I think there's interesting lessons in this. So this is a sow that's eating almost 14 pounds of feed per day on average. She's nursing 12 piglets. The piglets are gaining 240 grams a day, which is a pretty normal. That's not rock star growth, and it's not bad growth. So she's producing about 3 gallons of milk a day. When you think of a gallon container and fill that 3 times, that sow's she's working hard, right? That's pretty dang impressive. And by the way, if you want to calculate how much milk one of your sows is producing, if you know the growth rate of the litter, you multiply that by 4. Okay, so these pigs are gaining 240 grams a day. And to feed that one pig, you would multiply that by 4, so almost 1,000 grams or a liter. Okay, and so that's about a third of a gallon, little more. And so that's so you just multiply that by the number of pigs in the pen. So just body weight gain of the nursing pig times 4. In a number of studies, and it's varied from 3.7 to a little over 4, but 4 is a nice, easy number, and that's a nice thumb rule, because then that helps you do all kinds of other calculations for this sow. So this sow needs a total supply per day of 6.7 gallons of water. She drinks about 5.9 gallons, but notice that about 10% of her water comes from metabolic water. Remember I said earlier, building proteins, converting feed into energy sources, all those things use water, produce water. So this sow is producing metabolic water, and it represents about 10% of her daily supply. And then, of course, feed isn't perfectly dry, so there's a bit of water in the feed as well. So now on the losses side, so 3 gallons of milk per day, and then 2.6 gallons, almost as much, goes out in the urine. And that kind of fits with what you would see in the barn. Respiration represents about 0.8 gallons. 0.8 gallons, that's a lot of water. And that's why in the wintertime, when you're trying to ventilate your barn, you have to have a minimum ventilation rate to clear out the moisture. And that's where most of this moisture is coming from, is your pigs expiring air. Because that's part of the way pigs maintain their body temperature, right? They can't sweat very well. And so their way of maintaining constant body temperature is to expire air that's heavily laden with moisture. And so now some of the water in the barn that you have to get rid of through ventilation, of course, is evaporating from the pit and so on, and urine splash and so on. But a big chunk of it is respiration, and there's nothing you can do about that. So that's why you have to have a minimum ventilation rate to keep your barn dry. Okay. Moving on then, let's turn our attention to talking about water quality. Water quality can be measured in a number of ways. It can be measured in microbiological terms. What kind of microorganisms are in the water? We can measure it in terms of aesthetic terms. What color is the water? What odor does the water have? What taste does the water have? How turbid is the water? Turbid is the clarity of the water. Can you see through the water or not be able to see through the water? And then the third way, which I think is of greatest interest to us, at least generally, is the chemical composition of the water and the chemical contaminants that might exist in the water. By the way, I hate using the term contaminant, but I don't know what other term to use, because contaminant sounds like it's a bad thing. But if you were to, I don't know, has anybody ever drank distilled water? Completely tasteless. Right? You just don't want it to pass your lips. It's the minerals in the water, especially sodium, for example. And in fact, some of the very expensive waters that you buy, like Reb, was it Pellegrino? They said, yeah, Pellegrino. That they add sodium to the water to give it flavor. So you don't want water that's devoid of minerals. You just don't want water that has too much in the way of minerals. So we can evaluate in terms of microbiology, in terms of sort of aesthetics, and then in terms of chemical characteristics. So let's first talk about, I want to break this down a little differently this time, and I want to talk about issues that are related to the system mechanics, the operation of the water delivery system. So first there's hardness, and people talk about hard water, and sometimes it's a misused term. Hard water, the hardness of water is basically a measure of the calcium plus magnesium, expressed as calcium carbonate equivalents. That's what hardness is. So sulfate does not contribute to hardness of water. But some people will say, I have terrible hard water when it's high in sulfates, and it isn't necessarily hard water. Now, the sulfate is a negative ion. It's got to be there with some positive ions because water is neutral. So it could very well be that the cation that's there to balance the sulfate is sodium, right, and calcium, but it can also be magnesium. So just because it's high in sulfate doesn't mean it's hard water, but keep that in mind because some people will say, I've got really hard water when they mean it's high in sulfates. So hardness is this measure. So if it's less than 60 parts per million, so if I say milligrams per liter, but that's the same as parts per million, so they're interchangeable, that's considered to be soft water. Now, the reason we like water to be soft is if you are lathering up your washing or whatever, or you're washing dishes or whatever, the calcium that's in the water binds with the soap and it creates a film. So the more you wash, the less clean it is. Not quite, I'm exaggerating a little bit. But it creates this dang film, and so it's hard to get really clean. And that's why when you clean glassware with hard water, you get those stains on it. Well, that's what that is. That's those calcium things. If it's 60 to 120, it's considered moderately hard, and if it's over 100 between 120 and 121, it's considered hard water, and it's very hard if it's over 180. And water over 180 is not uncommon in this part of the world, and there's lots of hard water here. I'll come back later. With all of these things, I'm going to talk about how we can treat the water to resolve some of these issues. Iron is a tough one. We want iron to be less than 0.3 parts per million because iron, when it's in the water in the ground, is dissolved in the water. And when you pump that water from below the surface to the surface, it gets mixed with oxygen, and that oxidizes the iron, and the iron then, when it's in its oxidized form, which you will more commonly refer to as rust, right, red colored, then you've got a problem because it's no longer dissolved, it precipitates out and creates all kinds of problems. And iron can be, in my experience, in many circumstances, it's the number one quality issue in water because it's plugging up nipple drinkers, it's plugging up other filtration systems and so on, and it's causing grief in your hot water heater, etc. So iron can be a real problem. The other thing with iron is there's a type of bacteria, and all it needs to grow is iron. It doesn't need anything else. And because it can extract energy by changing the electron state of the iron. And that iron bacteria grows and can plug up your well like you wouldn't believe. And the problem with this iron bacteria is it coats the well, and you don't notice because you're getting enough water flow and it coats the well more and slows the flow of the well more, but you're still getting all the water you need, so you don't notice it until all of a sudden one day you're not getting as much water as you need because the iron bacteria have grown to the point that they've plugged the well enough that it's really slowed the supply of water to the well. And then you've really got a problem because getting rid of iron bacteria from a well is really difficult. The best method that I'm aware of, and because I don't talk about this later, is you actually blow steam down into the well casing, and then that dislodges the slime that these iron bacteria produce when they die. But it's really, really difficult to get rid of. So prevention is what you really want to do when it comes to dealing with iron bacteria. Manganese is like iron, but you only need 0.05 parts per million of manganese to have the same problem of this precipitation. And then finally, pH, and I'm going to come back and talk about pH in a minute, so I'm going to just pass that over. On the microbiological side now, and talking about pig health, I'm got to confess here, I have chosen the more conservative tolerance levels for microbiology in water. And that is for total bacteria, I'm using 100 colony forming units per mil. There's lots of places recommend 1,000. Okay, but there are some that recommend 100, and I'm going to explain a little bit later on why I'm more cautious on microbiology. And fecal coliforms, some books will say 100, and I'm saying 50. Really what we're doing here is we're really using this as sentinels or proxies. If we find some bacteria in the water, there could be other pathogens in the water as well. And if you find them, my recommendation is to go back and do a more thorough analysis to see if there's pathogens in the water that might be damaging to your pigs. And if it's fecal coliforms, then you know that there's the potential for fecal contamination of your water supply, and that greatly increases the potential that you've got pathogens of concern to pigs. Okay. Conductivity. I really don't like conductivity. That's what many labs use to estimate total dissolved solids. So total dissolved solids is really the measure of all the minerals that exist in the water sample. So if you took the water and put it on the oven and dried it out, or put it on the stove and dried it out, what's left over is total dissolved solids. And so what a lot of labs do, because it's faster and cheaper, is they use 2 electrodes that they put in the water, and the more minerals that are in the water, the more current you get between the 2 electrodes, and so the higher the reading, the more TDS you have. And so they multiply the conductivity by a factor, and that estimates TDS. Well, the problem is that the proper factor to convert conductivity to TDS differs depending on the geological origin of the water. And so it becomes then nothing better than an estimate of TDS. Okay, so I'm a TDS kind of guy and not a conductivity kind of guy. So if TDS then is less than 1,500, it's probably pretty safe water and you don't really need to worry about it. If it's between 1,500 and 3,000, you may see some transient diarrhea going on, but certainly we wouldn't expect it to affect performance at all. If TDS gets over 5,000, then you might see some drop in performance. You're going to see some fairly profuse diarrhea. So and our recommendation would be that if TDS is over 1,500, I would send the sample back to the lab and say, please now do the further analysis and say, what makes up that TDS? Is it calcium, magnesium, sulfate, sodium, etc.? I want to know what makes it up, because that tells me what kind of a problem I may or may not have. And then sulfates. If sulfates are less than 500, then you can figure it's pretty safe water. If it's over 500, then you're getting into a gray zone, and if it's over 1,500, even if it's over 1,000, you might see diarrhea, especially in nursery pigs, but it will not affect the performance of the pigs. And I'm going to show you some data on that. It's kind of hard to believe. These pigs, the diarrhea, it's an osmotic diarrhea. It's not a diarrhea based on pathogens. It's based on osmotic pressure caused by the minerals in the water. And as a result, your pigs have terrible diarrhea. They look awful, but they're performing fine. And it's hard to get that into our mind that these pigs that look so bad are still growing very well. We'll show you some data on that. The only study that I've seen, probably out of a dozen studies or more of sulfate level in pig performance, there was only one with less than 1,500 parts per million that affected performance. And in that particular case, the researchers repeated the study, and the second time they did it, they didn't get any drop in performance. So I think we can say that in the vast majority of cases, it's not going to affect performance. I'll be right with you. Just my final point, however, and there's a big caveat on this, we've never done a study to determine if the osmotic diarrhea caused by high sulfates makes the pig more susceptible to diarrheas that are due to a pathogen, or makes them more susceptible to the pathogens. That's a really important question that we have not yet answered, and we really need to answer. So that's my one proviso on that. We don't know that. Sorry.
Does the electrolyte or the minerals in your feed change your duration here? You're using electrolyte?
Yeah, typically not really, because normally the levels of calcium, magnesium, for example, that we have in the feed is most of them, or a large proportion of those, are going to be absorbed and used by the pig, whereas the water minerals are in excess of the nutritional requirement. The other thing to keep in mind, that's a really good question, because the other thing to keep in mind is the pig drinks at least twice as much water as it eats in feed. So if the pig's eating 1 kilogram of feed, it's drinking 2 liters of water. And so if you take those concentrations of minerals, to your point, and double them in terms of their effective level as it affects the pig, right? So it's at least a 2 to 1, and it could be, in hot weather, it could be 3 to 1. Yeah?
I don't know if this is relevant, but back to the iron issue with iron bacteria. My family has a horse ranch in Arizona, and we just went through an issue with our well where the pump ran out.
Right.
We had like this rust sludge that was blocking everything, and it would take days for our well system to clear up. Is that what you were referring to?
Yeah.
And it impact other animals like horses as well?
Well, it's the iron doesn't, I've never heard of the iron actually hurting the pigs, right? It just messes up the delivery system, and that's what hurts the pig. And so that would apply to your horses as well, right? Is that if the delivery system gets gummed up by the iron bacteria, then you've got a problem because they're not getting enough water.
But it's not a type of bacteria that would make us sick.
No.
Humans or-
No, those iron bacteria are really specific. Yeah, very, very specific. And they're not widespread, right? Yeah. Good. Benny.
Are there other bacteria, though, that can use iron as an
That's a good question, Denny. And I don't have a very good answer for you. I don't know. All I know is I know it's a category of bacteria that use iron. It's not just one particular species. It's a category of bacteria, but that's all I know. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. So this is what some of these things look like. This is what, if you have hard water, you get this sort of continuous scale building up, and it makes your water, ultimately it kind of squeezes off your water lines, and they're not delivering. Going back to your point, Wayne, this will affect the water delivery capability of the water system. I really did try to find a photo of a sink with iron stains on it rather than a toilet, just a little more publicly acceptable. Couldn't find it, so there you go. But that's exactly what it looks like. So you guys that work out at Swine Nutrition Farm, you know exactly what it looks like, right? And then biofilm is something that is of relatively recent discussion. We haven't talked about it in the past very much. It's kind of bad news that we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to, because what this is, this is really it's a living thing that's made up of many different bacteria, and they cover themselves with a polysaccharide coating so that disinfectants and so on don't reach them very well and don't clean them very well. And so it's really tough to get at them, and yet, as you can see, it has two adverse effects. Number one is it can plug up your system, but number two is, let's say you're delivering medication through your water lines, and it comes through a water line looking like this. Well, some of that medication isn't going to make its way through. It's going to stick to the biofilm and stay there. So you stop delivering medication in the water line, well, the pigs are going to continue to get medication after that, but at a very low level. And that's just an ideal environment for two things to happen. First off, when you're medicating the pigs, they're not getting the full dose, so you're not going to get effective treatment. And then when you take them off the medication, there's more of that medication dribbling through, which then is the perfect environment to enhance antimicrobial resistance. So this biofilm is something we're going to be paying a lot more attention to in the future, than we have in the past, because the implications are big. And Jason, you talked about dogma, and we got to change the way we think. Well, one of the ways I'm trying to change the way I think is that water is no longer as abundant as we think it is, and also that antibiotic reduced or antibiotic-free production is going to become more common. And when we are antibiotic-free, we have to create that as perfect an environment for the pig as possible, and we can't be shooting pathogens through the water system to the pigs. We have to figure out ways of minimizing that. Okay. Now, please understand, I'm not saying we're going to all go antibiotic-free tomorrow. I'm not saying that, but I think the trend is going to go in that direction. Yeah.
Do you know what the percentage of antibiotic-free production in the U.S. is?
No, but it's really low. Yeah, it's really, really low. And even in Europe, where they have gone more strongly to antibiotic-free, swine is much less than poultry and dairy and so on. So at this point in time, it's a relatively small portion. And I don't know whether you would agree with this, but I'm not seeing it grow, I don't think. At this point in time, I think some people are there to meet a market opportunity, but I don't know if that market opportunity is growing yet, at least. Yeah. Okay, let's talk about things that affect pig health. There's chloride, and if chloride gets too high, and I don't know the mechanism, but maybe over 1,000 parts per million, that could affect pig performance. And I'm sorry I don't have the mechanism, but that's something to keep in mind. We typically don't see water with high chloride levels in them, but we do from time to time. And if you get out into Colorado, Arizona area, then, at least from my experience, we see more high chloride water out there. Magnesium and sodium are associated with sulfates, as is calcium. And if calcium gets over 1,000 parts per million, that gets to be a bit of a concern to us as well. And it may impair the availability of other nutrients like zinc. There's pH. Boy, some people want to talk about pH like this. The pig wants a very narrow pH for ideal performance, and I'm sorry, I've just not seen any data to support that. I think if we stay between 6 and 8.5, I think we're doing fine. We do know if we get really high in pH, the water gets the kind of a metallic taste to it, and we don't want to get too high, but I don't think pH is really an issue. Nitrates, very important for children, very important. In fact, for humans, those numbers are 1/10 of what I've got up there. Okay, so what are the treatment methods? Moving along a little more quickly. For iron and manganese, if you want, all you really need to do is oxygenate the water, which isn't too hard to do as you pump it in the system. And if you have a cistern that you're pumping your water into and then you pump out of, well, then you let the water sit in that cistern, and it's amazing how much of that iron will just settle out all by itself. And if you chlorinate it, then it'll speed up that process and it'll drop out even faster. Now, you can certainly buy iron filters. They're not very expensive. You can put them in line. It's just one more thing that you have to maintain, but their iron filters are relatively standard kind of things. Iron bacteria, chlorination works well, and other disinfectants, hydrogen peroxide. Sulfates, the only system I know is reverse osmosis. The bacteria, also chlorination, chlorine dioxide, and hydrogen peroxide. Hardness, ion exchange. The thing to keep in mind with hardness is when you use an ion exchange water softener like you would use in your home, it replaces the calcium and magnesium with sodium. So you go from low sodium water potentially to high sodium water. So if you're doing it in your home and you happen to be on a low sodium diet, an ion exchange softener is not a good thing to have, right? Because you're going to increase your sodium intake. And remember that it will add 2 sodium molecules for every calcium or magnesium molecule because it's an ion exchange and calcium and magnesium have 2 charges and sodium has 1. For hard, and then for pH, you can add acid or base, but that only becomes an issue on medication, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so let's look at some data. This was a study done on a 1,200 sow Farrow-to-finish single-site unit. They had a reverse osmosis unit in place, which we were able to take advantage of. This is the water prior to treatment with reverse osmosis, and this is the water after it had been treated. TDS dropped from over 3,000 to 220 parts per million. Reverse osmosis works. Sulfate dropped from 1650 down to 29. Remember that sulfate level of 1650. It changed the pH by about a half a unit. Took the hardness out, of course, because it takes out most of the ions. Dropped the iron. That's a lot of iron, isn't it? Remember what I was saying? You want it lower than 0.3, and these were 7.3, but dropped it to 0.4, etc. So RO worked, and this is the performance from 13 to 47 pounds. Absolutely no effect of reverse osmosis in terms of improving average daily gain or improving feed efficiency. Absolutely no effect whatsoever. It reduced water intake a little bit. Remember I pointed out earlier, poor quality water, the pigs seem to drink a little bit more of it. So that was interesting. But the folks working in the barn refused to believe the data. Right? They said, my pigs look like what they look like, and I don't believe those pigs are performing equally. So we reran the experiment. I won't show you the data, and got exactly the same result. But it is, you have to appreciate somebody is used to looking for diarrhea and learn that diarrhea means pigs aren't doing well. Now we're telling them pigs can have diarrhea, profuse diarrhea, and they're doing fine. So then Bridget Lazinski just did a study last year at University of Minnesota. She had 3 level qualities of water. These were waters that they actually brought in from farms. And so the sulfates from 1120, 600, and 2. And so here's the performance. And you can see absolutely no effect on average daily gain, on average daily feed, or gain to feed. So absolutely the same results that we got 20 years earlier. Really nice study that Bridget did. Water sanitation, just going to make a few general points. I'm kind of thinking that we in the pig industry should look at disinfection of our drinking water supply more like the poultry people do, because it's much more common in the poultry sector to disinfect drinking water continuously, and yet, in my experience, it's relatively rare in our industry. Is that a fair statement, Wayne? Right. Yeah. Yeah, it would certainly be a huge help. And it's much easier to do, Wayne, and also it opens up a whole array of products that you can use for shock disinfection that you can't allow pigs to drink, but you can use it to clean the water lines as long as you flush the water lines out really well before you refill the barn. So it can prevent low-level exposure of pathogens. It can help to prevent the formation of biofilms. However, it's really difficult to run a study to show an economic advantage. This is really a preventative thing. The treatments that I see most common would be bleach or chlorine, just like you use in your swimming pool. Everybody here has their own personal swimming pool? Yeah. And chlorine dioxide, and then hydrogen peroxide, which I'm seeing being used more and more. Hydrogen peroxide and chlorine both have a fairly broad profile of what they will kill. Hydrogen peroxide is safer to work with than chlorine is. And only some disinfectants are acceptable to use in drinking water. Is water a good way to deliver medication and nutrients? Well, there's a whole bunch of issues involved here that concern me. Number one, with the greatest of respect to manufacturers, the medicators, we have to make sure that the medicators are diluting the water to the level that we expect them to be doing, and that's not always happening. We have to know water intake by the pigs, because really we're not giving a percent or parts per million of medication to the pigs, we're giving them a daily dose. And so we need to know water intake, which most of us don't know. And then we have to know the range in intake. But that happened in feed too. Some pigs eat more feed than others, so some pigs would get more medication than others. But that's still an issue with water. But the other one is the optimum pH. Some medications prefer a high pH and others a low pH. So for example, some of the medications that like a pH below 7 would be chlortetracycline, oxytetracycline, thiamulin, and lincomycin HCl. Neomycin sulfate and penicillin G like a neutral pH, and bacitracin MD, erythromycin, and tilazin like a higher pH. So we need to take that into account when we're medicating through the water to make sure the pH of the water is correct for the medication we're using. Otherwise, we may have some medication precipitate out. We may not get the delivery that we think we are or want. Okay, I'm going to finish off with water supply issues. This was a quote from the New York Times on June the 10th. Amid historic drought, a new water war in the West. Farmers infuriated that they have been cut off from their main water source. So tell me, when there's a conflict for water or anything else between urban dwellers, industry, and farming, who comes out number 3? Just about every time you can think of. And that's one of the reasons I'm worried about water. Here's another one from California. This gentleman who's a farm manager, he says there's no water. And so he left his fields unplanted. And that was from Reuters. And another report from Reuters, this is the Hoover Dam reservoir. You can see it's down by 140 feet since the year 2000. That's a lot of water. So, and here we can see the aquifers where we're drawing water from. And here in Iowa, we're in that area where the groundwater depletion from 1900 to 2008 is between 10 and 25 cubic kilometers. 1 cubic kilometer is over 200 billion gallons of water. So that's a lot of water. But the thing is, if we have wells that are deep enough, the water level can be going down, but we're still getting all the water we need because our well's deep enough, even though the water level's gone down. Around Chicago and Milwaukee, there's aquifers there that are down 800 feet from where they were in the mid-1800s. 800 feet. And that's right beside Lake Michigan. So you'd think the aquifers would be recharged fairly well. So I just thought I would bare my soul to you and show you what I'm paying for utilities in my house. Sorry, Reb. Hope you're okay with this. And so this is what my month or my annual bill for electricity has been, and it's gone up, but lately stayed fairly stable. This is what I've been paying for natural gas, and it's bouncing around, but it's kind of stable. But this is water. And it was below $500 a year, and now it's well over $1,000 a year. So we're already seeing the impact. So to finish up, and I've gone over time, and I apologize for that. I should know better at my age. There's 2 periods when water intake requires greater attention, and that's the farrowing sow and the newly weaned pig. Water quality may impact system operation, or it may impact pig health. So those are the 2 reasons why we're interested in water quality. I think continuous disinfection of water should be more common in our industry, but Wayne, I don't disagree with you that if we just flush the system before every fill would be a huge move in the right direction. Delivering medication and nutrients through the water is a really nice way to do it. You can turn it on and off on a dime, but it has its challenges that we need to be aware of. And finally, I think it's fair to say at some point, and I have no idea when, but water supply will become an increasingly critical issue in pork production here in Iowa. Sorry, that's not a very positive note to end on. And I don't have any jokes and I don't have any time. So, but thank you very much. I really appreciate your patience.